So when I realized that I was taught incorrectly this reality and that I was mistaken, then that led me to do a greater, deeper dive in many other aspects. And obviously, at this stage of my life, I mean, you know, I am a generic Muslim. I don't really view any particular sect or interpretation as being divine. They're all, you know, human products in the end of the day. Let us try to maximize the good in all of these trends, and let us try to minimize the sectarianism and the negative. That's really my ultimate call to my fellow Muslims.
You know, there's this oft-quoted hadith which says there's a al-firqa al-najiyah, the saved sect. The ummah will be divided into 73 sects. Only one will be saved. And of course, Salafis said, this is us. In my book, my earlier book, I showed that actually all sects said, that is us, right? There's only one saved sect, and of course, that is us. So there's been interpretations of that. Now, can we be skeptical of this hadith, or at least its interpretations in that way? I'm asking this with a Quranic, you know, warning in mind. You know, the Quran criticizes those who divide their religion into sects, with each party rejoicing on their own. So did we fall into that problem that the Quran is actually warning us against by having a very sectarian view of Islam among some groups? And can this hadith be understood in a different way, or can we be even consider whether it's sahih or not, or how certain the knowledge it gives to us?
Well, obviously, this is a very detailed topic. So to summarize, the hadith about the 73 groups or sects, every single group in Islamic history that accepted this hadith considered themselves to be the saved sect. So this isn't just Salafis applying this hadith to themselves.
Yeah, sure.
If I'm not mistaken, I think even Nawawi or others of the 12ers, they kind of think they're the saved sect here. So the notion of the saved sect being unique to the Salafis is simply not true. Every single strand of Islam, in fact, the term Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, when you use it in India, Pakistan, you actually primarily refer to the Barelvi or the Sufi sect of Islam, and they are extremely sectarian as well. And you have also the Ahbash, the Habashis, who also use that term and are just as sectarian, if not more so. So again, the reason I point this out is not to defend the Salafis, because I have my long list of critiques against them, but to merely point out much of what people criticize Salafis for is actually fairly common in all conservative branches of Islam. So the notion that we are the correct group is fairly standard amongst all interpretations of Islam, not just Salafis. And the hadith that you mentioned, the reference, there's multiple ways. So again, it depends on who you ask here, right? So again, I'm being historical here. So firstly, from the Sunni paradigm, and if I'm not mistaken, even some of the Shia paradigm as well, they would accept this hadith as being valid. The Ash'aris accept it as being valid. The Salafis accept it as being valid. And then the difference occurs, how do we understand this hadith? From the Sunni paradigm, very few people have considered these hadith to be weak. Ibn Hazm, Ibn Khaldun, in our times Al-Qardawi, and of course the saved sect, or the 73 group hadith, and only one is the saved one. That's not found in Bukhari and Muslim. It's only found in the secondary works, and so that is one of the points that is used by some minority voices within Sunnism to suggest that the Prophet might not have said these things. But that is a minority view. As a default, majority of Sunnis would accept these ahadith to be valid. That having been said, one does find a very good effort by people like Ash-Shawkani, As-San'ani, who accepted the hadith at face value, but then they understood that this hadith could potentially be problematic if it's misunderstood. And so what they attempted to do, As-San'ani, of course, considers himself to be a follower of Ibn Taymiyyah, so he's Salafi in that sense. Obviously, he wouldn't use the term. But it's interesting that a Salafi figure is actually attempting to tone down the sectarianness of this hadith. And he has an entire treatise on it. And in it, he argues that actually the bulk of the Muslim world is by default a part of the saved sect. And that the other sects, the other movements, they are very short-lived and small. So the Jahmiyyah of the past, or the Murji'ah of the past, these are some of those bizarre fringe groups. As a default, we need to widen the scope of who the saved sect is, and the bulk of the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad should be considered to be of that main group. So that's an interesting take on the hadith, in which he considered the hadith to be valid, but then he said, but guys, what does it mean that if you're, a misguided sect, it doesn't mean the majority of the ummah is misguided. No, these are all fringe movements, and the bulk of the prophetic followers are actually a part of that saved movement. So I think that's an interesting historical take on the hadith as well. And again, in the end of the day, it depends on which scholar you follow and what your source of authority is, of whether you're going to accept this hadith, because obviously Shaykh Qardawi denied the authenticity of this hadith along with many scholars. And then obviously you do have the sectarian minded, and then you have those that I find very interesting, which is basically, let's take the hadith as valid, but let's be careful about misapplying that hadith and actually creating problems that, as you point out, seem to contradict the Quran, because the Quran does not have sectarianism, within the ummah. The Quran really is saying, come together. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. The Quran is saying that, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ, all the believers are one group and brethren. So that spirit of San'ani and others, where they're trying to find the Quranic spirit while accepting these hadith, I believe this is a nice way to explain it and retain both of them. And again, depends on who you ask and which interpretation you follow.
Thank you so much. This is very helpful. Now, another thing I would like to ask you is the nuances you highlight between Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, who's very big in the whole Salafi movement, the pioneer, and the movement known as Wahhabism, that emerged as a revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century. So is it correct, for example, on some issues, Ibn Taymiyyah criticized the practices of other Muslims, sometimes harshly, but didn't go as far as considering them as kafir, didn't do the takfir on them. That was done by the early Wahhabi movement, although it has toned down that too. Is that correct? Like the line you show there?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And one of the biggest cognitive dissonances that one finds within the modern practitioners of Wahhabism is their claim that they are tapping in directly to Ibn Taymiyyah's thought. And this is simply not true. Ibn Taymiyyah did criticize many Sufi practices, including invoking the dead and calling out to the saints. But he never accused those who did them to be outside the fold of Islam, much less wage war against them and literally kill them or massacre them. He never did that. He was very harsh theoretically about critiquing those ideas. And yet, one-on-one, when he interacted with the very people he criticized, he showed a care and compassion and concern, and he considered them to be fellow believers. So he didn't like what they were saying, and he considered it to be a misguided belief, but he did not view the people who did these practices to be outside the fold of Islam. In contrast to this, obviously, Ibn Abdul Wahhab really took this to a level that is almost unprecedented, and without a doubt unprecedented in mainstream Sunnism. And hence the claim came by his critics that he's not Sunni, but that's a whole different topic altogether. And that was his claim that anybody who doesn't agree with my interpretation of God's monotheism, their disagreement is enough to consider them to be outside the fold of Islam. And this then translated into a political disagreement, i.e., if you do not take a stand against the Ottoman Empire, because in his mind, the Ottoman Empire was a pagan empire. There was no doubt in his mind and in the mind of his immediate followers that the Ottoman Empire, because it supported rituals like invoking the dead, or it was tacitly allowing them to occur because he was so, it was basically like a type of guilt by association. If you don't actively oppose a grave in your vicinity, a grave that is being venerated in your vicinity, then all of you are guilty of polytheism, and you are no longer Muslim, and we may wage war against you and basically acquire your town and property. And of course, that's exactly what his followers did, so much so that infamously his sons and his first generation of followers, he was dead at that time, he passed away, his sons and the first generation of followers even attacked Mecca and Medina. They laid siege to Mecca and Medina. They considered the imams of the Haram to be outside the fold of Islam. And they forced them to retract and to say, we were non-Muslims, we were pagans, and you were correct in attacking us, and we have repented, and we are now Muslims, followers of the true faith. It was that attack in 1805 that prompted Muhammad Ibrahim Pasha, the Ottoman Albanian governor in in Egypt, to send his son and to basically get rid of the first Saudi dynasty because they had taken over Mecca and Medina. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire could not tolerate that. But yes, you're absolutely right that there is a marked difference between Ibn Taymiyyah and Abdul Wahhab in many areas. Ibn Taymiyyah is an erudite thinker. He's an intellectual. Ibn Taymiyyah is well-read. You can strongly disagree with him. Sure, you cannot doubt his intelligence. You cannot doubt his level of erudite thought. He's quoting from a myriad of sources: Christianity, philosophers, the Ash'ari, Sufis. He's read everything and he's quoting them. And his writings indicate that. Ibn Abdul Wahhab, to be polite here, there's just no comparison in terms of the breadth, in terms of the depth, in terms of the profundity. There's simply no comparison whatsoever. And then obviously the issue of takfir, as you mentioned, there is a marked difference between Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab.
Well, I read Ibn Taymiyyah and some issues I found him fascinatingly, positive and even progressive on things like triple talaq. I think he was right, but he was targeted for that on his time, the triple divorce issue, which still is an issue in India and elsewhere in the Muslim world. And on your point about the sectarianism, I think sectarian groups always claim to elevate Islam, but to me, they seem to elevate themselves, their group. Like it turns into a group narcissism. And I think especially when it turns into violent, that is. Now, one thing, there are many questions I actually listed, but I will not get into all of them. And our group, of course, our friends will get in. Towards the end of your book, you share your personal reflections on how you moved on from Salafism, if that's the right way to put it, into a more post-sectarian, more, encompassing, embracing view of Islam. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well, please?
Yeah. So I did return from the University of Medina very much a fan of Ibn Taymiyyah. And believing that Ibn Abdul Wahhab maybe was a little bit fanatic, but overall he was right in his theology, but maybe harsh in his actions. That was my view in 2005. But obviously, just being involved in global issues and interacting with large groups of people and being active in the community, you find it very difficult to hold these views in which you are taught that your fellow Muslims are basically grave worshippers or, worshiping other than God. And that doesn't make any sense because they're clearly not worshiping other than God. But that's what you are taught. And so I really had to, this is around 2010 or so, it's been 15 years now, where I really had to just rethink through, because the main appeal of Wahhabis to this day is their claim that invoking the dead saints is exactly the same as a pagan worshiping a god, or even the Christian claim of invoking Jesus, right? So when a Sufi says Ya Ghawth al-A'zam, Ya Ali Madad, Ya Rasulullah, in the eyes of the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, this is exactly like a pagan worshiping a god, false god, or a Christian saying Jesus save me, right? And Muslims don't view it's permissible for Christians to call out to Jesus. So if that is shirk, why isn't this shirk? So they teach you this, and of course they have their nice arguments for it, and I defended those arguments and I taught those arguments. But you need to take a step back and understand there's a very different paradigm. And it is simply incorrect to equate the practices of Sufis with the practices of pagans. It's a massive disconnect between their paradigms. And it takes a while to think through, to be re-educated, and it requires an open mind, which obviously you have to decide to have an open mind. So when I realized that I was taught incorrectly this reality and that I was mistaken, then that led me to do a greater, deeper dive in many other aspects. And obviously, at this stage of my life, I am a generic Muslim. I don't really view any particular sect or interpretation as being divine. They're all, human products. In the end of the day, as I say, as a Muslim, God did not send neither Ibn Taymiyyah, nor Ghazali, nor Al-Razi, nor Ibn Rushd for me to follow. And I guess in that sense, I'm still Salafi-esque, because the real role model should only be one person, that is the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, right? So in that sense, call me post-Salafi, whatever it might be. But I have moved on. but I still do not wish to demonize any trend of Islam, and I think it is a mistake to stereotype and caricature any trend, including Salafism. And even if my Salafi critics think that I am their harshest critic, on the contrary, I do not view myself as a critic. I simply say there's good in them and there's other than good, and the same applies for every single trend. Let us try to maximize the good in all of these trends, and let us try to minimize the sectarianism and the negative. That's really my ultimate call to my fellow Muslims.
Totally agreed on that too, especially at a time when there's so much hatred and injustice targeting
Exactly.
Muslims today. I mean, sectarianism is the last thing we need, I think, and I think we should be more open-minded for the values of Islam and also our, I think, future.